Okay guys, so in this video we'll walk through how basically how we implemented a login registration system. So let's just have a look. So here's nothing, well, very little has changed on our UI level, but the one thing that I have added is this logout button here, and the reason for that is because I didn't want to go all the way to, like in the real Slack application, you actually have a drop down here, which is the place where you log out primarily, and it's full of list items and like different things. It's a lot more complicated, and we need to make this to just support this sort of feature. If we wanted to go all the way and support every feature in Slack, we could have gone that way, but for now I think this is just fine. So we click here and we go to this very minimalistic login page, which just has a few fields, and we can also go to the register page, and that's about it. And if we just input some random stuff, we get this error unauthorized. I haven't actually even added error handling to this because, yeah, hey, it's not really important for learning purposes. But we could, of course, make this a much nicer user experience. And if we go to the registration page and we try to like register with a name that is taken, for example, they're just gonna tell us, and yeah, that's about it really. So if I now go and I log in with a user that I have created, as we can see now, like we're actually getting directed to the general tab, and we're actually immediately loading the general channel because there's at this point in time in the system only one single channel, and that is the general channel. There's no concept of different channels, which is something we were going to look at a later stage. But that's basically how it works. And if I go to my applications tab here, we see that I have my little session token here. If I remove that session and I refresh, I get redirected to the login page because I am not logged in. And then I log in again. And that's about it. So that's it. Let's have a look at the code. So first and foremost, we've added a few new dependencies. We are using bcrypt, connect mongo, and express session. And if we have a look at the server here, I just, because I needed to refactor this a little bit because I decided to store the session in MongoDB instead of adding another dependency to something like Redis, for example. Well, I did that more or less because of convenience purposes. We can add a dependency to something like Redis to do session storage, which is actually a very popular and very common thing to do in in the industry, but this works as well. So I basically did that, and then I renamed our files. A few, like instead of having the name index.html, I call this main.html now. Just like there was an issue with the application loading the index.html page instead of the file that I wanted, so I just renamed it to kind of sort that issue out. Nothing super interesting. And here we have a few new dependencies or imports rather. So we have our sessions and our Mongo store, and I'm importing a user service, and then I've added a few other dependencies like is logged in with redirect, is logged in, config, and user view. So let's just walk through that. So in order to add our session, we use the session middleware. And basically all I'm doing here is I'm declaring an environmental variable called secret, or then it's going to use secret as a default, but this is going to be something much more secure when we make a distribution build. And then I connect this to a store. So basically the concept of store is that a session the express session middleware will by default just keep everything in memory, which means that if I restart the server, the session for all the users is going to go away, and I don't want that. I want to persist my session for our users to a database of some sort, and that's where the store comes in. Now there's support for multiple stores, and in another video I actually did this with Redis instead, and maybe that is the way to go, but hey, this will work as well. So I'm just using MongoDB to actually store the session information for the user. And then I've added support for URL encoded messages or post bodies, which means basically that I'm supporting the possibility of sending, like submitting a form without actually using AJAX or XHR to do that. And that's just to keep things simple, because the login and the registration page doesn't require any JavaScript, so I didn't see any reason to do that, to add it. And now we can see here that I've added a route for just getting the root, which is going to get us the main HTML file, which is going to load up the application. And then I have a get for both the register and login. And is logged in with the redirect. Let's just really quickly look at that. So that's a middleware that I added. And basically what it's going to do is that it's going to check if there is a session, and if there is a user session or user ID associated with that session, and if that is the case, it's going to just allow the user through. But if that's not the case, it's going to redirect the user to the login page, because I don't want the user to be able to access the application without actually logging in first. And that's about it, really. And then we have like a route for getting the registration page. So I send register.html on this route. It doesn't have to have any validation, because hey, I want the user to be able to access this route regardless if there's a session or not. Same thing for login. And then I have a route for logout, which is just going to destroy the session and redirect back to the login page, so that when we click the logout link, we just want to destroy the session so that the user is correctly logged out. And then we have a post handler here for register, which is just going to extract the username and the password from the body. And then on our user service, we've added a method called register user that just takes these two inputs, and it's going to return a user, and then we're going to store the user's ID on the session, that's basically it. Same thing goes for, and then of course we're going to redirect to the root URL, which means that if there's now a session, then the user is going to actually see the application. And the same thing goes for login. That's about it, really. So, and then we added this little method here, which is logged in, which is just it's a function that this method just returns a user. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the user ID on the session, or the session's user ID, grab the user, and return a user view. Now, what is a user view? Well, that's a very good question. You see, a user view is something that let's just fundamentally ask, what is a view? A view is a representation of some type of information that you want to send to the client. A view can be HTML, a view can be JSON, it can be any number of things, but what we want here is that we want to send information about our user that our client needs, but we don't want to send everything. The reason we don't want to send everything is because so we've updated our user model, so now there's a username, a password, and a last visited channel. Now, we've added a default of general here as well, so we'll touch on that in just a moment. But what's important here is that there's a password. Now, you do not want to send the password to the client for any reason, because there should be no scenario, as far as I know, where you want to send the password or some type of private information over the network. And that's where the user view comes in. So the user view is just a subset of the user model, because we have to make a distinction between that. Your model is the data that you have privately in your system, in your database, but that doesn't mean that you want to send all that information to the user. You want to send a view. You want to send a representation of what you need on the client. And that's what we're doing. So that is about it, really. And then I added some a is logged in middleware to the other routes, and a 404 handler, so that if we actually get a request that doesn't actually, it doesn't lead anywhere, I do something like that, we actually see, okay, 404, cool. So that's that basically. We can look at is logged in. It's very similar to logged in with redirect. All it's going to do is that, hey, it's going to do the same check, but instead of redirecting, it's going to call next with a status error. Now, what is a status error? Well, I'm glad you asked. So a status error is just a subtype of error which has a status code. And if we remember back in when we actually define this, means that this little method down here is now going to have a possibility of having a truthy value here. In other words, we can define a status code and actually get the correct response. And that's exactly what this status error is there for, so that we can actually express that, hey, this user is not logged in, so that we can actually respond. Like if a user does actually make an AJAX request, we want to be able to express that, hey, this is not a validated user anymore. Right, let's have a look at the user service. So there's quite a few things that have changed here as well. So basically we have login user and register user, and these two methods is, we can actually have a full screen look at that. So login and register user. So the first thing we're going to do is that if a user tries to log in, we get the username and the password, and we simply try to find a user that has the corresponding username. If there is none, then hey, then we just throw a new error, call that unauthorized. And then we basically check if there is a user, then we want to compare the provided password to the password that we store in the database. Now, why are we using bcrypt for this? Well, the reason why we do that is maybe more clear if we look at the registration. So it's very similar. We grab a user if there is a user, rather when we try to register. If there is already a user, hey, that username is taken, and then we throw an error. But otherwise, we will just grab the password from the registration attempt and hash it, because the thing is that we don't want to store a password in plain text in the database, because if our system is compromised, or say there's a data leak or something, like a hacker or whatever gets a hold of that information, we don't want a user to leak, or we don't want to leak the password, and it's just good form to hash a password. And that's where this comes in. So using something like bcrypt to encrypt the password is the preferred way of doing it, because what now happens is that we are in our database not storing the actual password, we're storing a hash of that password. And that's all we need, because whenever a user wants to log in, we do the same thing here. All we're going to do is that we're going to compare the password, the plain text password that is coming into the system, with the stored hash. And if they result in the same hash, then the user has inputted the correct password. Easy peasy. So that's about it, really. The registration just creates this hash, stores the model, and returns it, and the login is just going to try to compare the username and the password, and just make sure that, hey, we actually, yeah, that's about it. All right, let's see here. We've added the concept of an application as well. Let's actually look at that as well. So in order to accommodate some of these changes, let's actually look at the main let's look at the main div first and foremost. That might be more than illustrated better. So I've reshuffled a few things here. So we have a isLoggedIn method that is on the user API, and that's hopefully going to be fairly straightforward. We have this user API file now where we can just just make a request to the login endpoint, and as we saw earlier, this is just going to return a user if we're actually logged in. We might refactor this a little bit later to handle like error cases and stuff like this, but for now that's good enough. And then we added an app reducer, an app init state, and a set user. And then we have another reducer, which we call the app reducer, and we just initialize that. And then we do this. So we create a closure around our main application JS file, which means that the first thing that's going to happen when the user logs into the application is that we are going to get the user, or rather call this isLoggedIn method, get the user back, and then we're going to set the user on our global state. And that's about it, really. There's very little else that has changed. Now, the reason we want to do that, on the other hand, is going to be a little bit clearer in just a moment. So I've shuffled around a few files as well here, like moved content, CSS, and stuff like that, but it's nothing super important, actually. The same thing goes for here, like header.js is like some small changes to just the layout so that we could actually group these two together. And the same thing goes for header CSS, nothing super fancy, with some small changes to the CSS. But this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. So what we can see here now is that we have added set selected channel to our little, well, basically the way that we like this sidebar entry point. So what we're going to do now is that we've removed this idea of like a general channel being created if there is none, because what we're going to do in the next, like we're going to have a think about in the future of, okay, so when do we actually want to create the general channel? Is it when the first user logs in? Yes or no? Should we create it when the application starts? These sorts of things. It's a later question, but now that we actually have a general channel already created and a user can actually create their own account, it doesn't really make any more sense for us to keep this around at this point in time. So I've just removed this because it was just for testing purposes. We don't really need it anymore. So what we're going to do now is we're going to get the channels, and we're going to set the channels that are retrieved. And if we go to the actual file, we'll see here that what's actually going to happen next. And this is where why we need the user. So on the user model, we have last visited channel. And basically what we want to do is that when we bootstrap this application, this component, we want to go and get the last visited channel, go through all the channels, and just find the channel that has a name that matches the last visited channel. But now, as we saw before, if there is no last visited channel, we're simply going to, well, it's just going to be general. And since general is the only channel that we have in the system right now, that's always going to match. And that's why we don't, as we previously had, we don't have to actually click this to select and get this label here. We can just refresh it and we will actually be there. And that's about it, really. So that's why we want to have a user when we actually start the application, because we've decided to store that information on the user model. And then we've added some, like a login CSS file, like the main CSS file was updated a little bit. So as you can see here now, because I didn't have any JavaScript in this content directory, I felt that, hey, I'll just put that in the same directory as the main.css file together with the login.css file, because it doesn't make sense that it doesn't have a component yet it's in the components directory. And we already looked at the user API, and we removed this index.html file in favor of just calling it main.html. And then we have a very simple little main login.html file that is just going to be this little, it's just a login page basically. And the same thing goes for register with a few deviations from login. And that's about it, really. So next up, like now that we can actually log in and stuff of this nature, we'll take a look at actually being able to post some messages to this general channel. And later on, we're going to touch on that later. We're going to be able to like create different channels and stuff of this nature. But we also have to ask a fundamental question, which is kind of interesting, is if everybody should have the same namespace of the application, because we might have to add a story later on where we can actually add different workspaces. So instead of just having FLAC or like as the standard, because hey, if everybody is on the same application, that's not going to be very useful to us. We need to be able to express that, hey, I want to start a group that is called foo, and you can start a group that's called bar, and so forth. But that's for later. So next up, we're going to have a look at posting messages.